The kitchen was a modest one, hidden behind tall stone walls that had long shielded the house from the curious eyes of the world outside. It was lined with cabinets that bore the gentle scuffs of years of use, a testament to the generations who had moved through its small, sunlit space. This morning the air carried the scent of fresh bread, the warmth of the oven mingling with the distant hum of city life beyond the garden gate. A woman stood at the sink, her back to the room, her hands submerged in soapy water as she washed the breakfast dishes. Her hair, a tumble of chestnut waves, was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, allowing a few strands to escape and catch the light. She hummed a melody, one so old that even the shadows of the house seemed to lean in, to listen. Her voice was soft, tinged with a sweetness that spoke of memories, of lullabies and whispered secrets shared beneath the glow of a night lamp. Outside the window, the sun pressed its golden hands against the glass, eager to pour itself into every corner of the house. The woman paused, lifting a dish to examine it in the light, her reflection blurred by the smudged pane. She sighed and set the dish on the drying rack, then dipped her hands back into the water, chasing the last remnants of soap bubbles that danced on the surface. Unbeknownst to her, just beyond the doorway, a man watched. He stood in the shadow of the hallway, the morning sun brushing his profile with a gentle hand. His eyes, gray and lined with a weariness that only time bestows, were fixed on the woman at the sink. He had never intended to return home at that hour. His schedule usually claimed by meetings and demands that piled one atop the other like the architecture he once adored. But a delay, a missed call, had brought him back to the house he owned but barely recognized as his own. His name was Matteo Fontana, a name that carried weight in the city's circles of design and influence. People spoke of him with a kind of reverence reserved for those who had shaped skylines and transformed old quarters into living museums. Yet none of that mattered here, not in this quiet moment. Here he was just a man who had found himself drawn by a song. He had never heard her sing before. He had never heard anyone sing in that house. It had always been a place of silence, its rooms arranged like a museum, each piece chosen for its style and prestige rather than the warmth it could offer. The kitchen, though, had always seemed different. It bore the marks of life. A dented kettle here, a chipped mug there, the evidence of meals shared, of laughter that had once filled the corners before time and distance had driven it away. Matteo shifted his weight, the wooden floor beneath him creaking in protest. He stilled, his breath caught in his throat, hoping she wouldn't notice. She didn't. Her melody continued, weaving its way through the kitchen and beyond, a thread of light against the gray tapestry of his thoughts. She was not the regular housekeeper. Her name was Emilia, he'd learned from the note the agency had left on the kitchen counter, beside a carefully folded cleaning schedule. Emilia had arrived just 2 weeks earlier, though Matteo hadn't met her yet. He'd been away on business, and when he returned, he'd been too preoccupied to pay attention. It was only by chance that he was home at this hour, that he'd heard the notes of her song floating down the hallway, pulling him like a child drawn to the smell of baking bread. She moved with a kind of grace that felt out of place in that kitchen. Each gesture, rinsing the plates, stacking them carefully, seemed practiced but also personal, as though she carried the weight of every dish she had ever washed. Matteo found himself captivated by the smallness of the moment, the way it glowed with something he had not known he'd been missing. He took a step forward, his intention muddled by a sudden, inexplicable shyness. He was a man who had given lectures to crowds, who had negotiated contracts worth millions, who had stood at the center of rooms where all eyes turned to him. Yet now, in the presence of a woman singing to her dishes, he felt like a boy again, uncertain, hesitant, aware of every breath. She reached for a glass, her song softening to a hum. The light caught the rim, refracting into a rainbow that danced across the countertop. Her gaze shifted upward, and for a moment, Matteo thought she might turn and see him there, frozen in the doorway like a ghost. But she didn't. Her focus remained on the glass, on the water that trickled over it, carrying away the residue of the morning meal. He wondered what she saw in that glass. If she saw reflections of her life, her hopes, her regrets. He wondered what melody lived inside her, what stories she carried that had yet to find their way to the world. He wondered, too, why he suddenly felt that he needed to know those things. Mateo's hand rested against the doorframe, the cool wood grounding him in a way that nothing else had in months. He had lived a life of schedules and strategies, of plans made and executed with precision. Yet here, in this small kitchen, his heart beat to a rhythm he could not measure. The song faded into silence, replaced by the hush of the running water and the occasional clink of dishes being placed in the rack. Amelia wiped her hands on a faded cloth, her expression serene, though her eyes held a flicker of something that spoke of distance, a glance that reached beyond the kitchen walls to somewhere only she could see. Mateo's throat tightened and he found himself retreating, his footsteps soft but certain. He slipped back into the hallway, into the place where shadows swallowed him whole. He felt like an intruder, a man who had stumbled upon a secret not meant for him. He had spent so many years building walls, both real and imagined, that he had forgotten what it meant to see someone simply existing. No pretense, no performance, just a song and a sink full of dishes. He made his way to his study, a room lined with books he'd rarely touched in recent years. He sat at his desk, his mind replaying the image of Amelia at the sink, her voice a balm he hadn't known he needed. He told himself it was curiosity, that he merely wanted to know who this woman was and why her presence unsettled him. But deep down, he recognized the truth. He was drawn to the light she carried, to the quiet defiance of her song in a house that had forgotten how to sing. In the days that followed, he found excuses to remain at home. Meetings were postponed, phone calls diverted to voicemail. He lingered in doorways, in hallways, in corners where he could watch her without being seen. She moved through the house with a quiet determination, tending to her duties with care, but never with haste. She opened the curtains in rooms he had kept shuttered, letting the light pour in as though the house itself needed reminding that it was still alive. He noticed how she paused sometimes, her eyes catching on details, a photograph on the mantel, a vase in the hallway, and how she would linger, her gaze soft as if remembering something. He wondered what stories lived behind those eyes, what chapters of her life had led her here, to this kitchen, to this moment. One afternoon, as the sun stretched its golden arms across the garden, Mateo stood at the edge of the dining room, watching her set the table. She sang again the same melody that had first drawn him to her. Her voice was untrained, but it held a purity that made him ache. It reminded him of a time when he, too, had believed in simple things: sunlight on water, the warmth of a hand in his, the promise of laughter at the end of a long day. Amelia finished her song and set down the last plate. She turned then, her eyes meeting his for the first time. He felt the world tilt, the air charged with something he couldn't name. She smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that carried 1,000 unspoken words. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice softer than the song she'd been singing. Mateo found his own voice, though it trembled. "Good afternoon," he replied. He wanted to say more, to ask her to sing again, to tell her that her song had reached a part of him he'd thought long dead. But the words lodged in his throat, and he stood there silent, his heart pounding. Amelia tilted her head, her smile fading into something more thoughtful. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. He shook his head. "No," he said, too quickly. "No, I was just—" He stopped, unsure how to explain the truth. She nodded, as if understanding something he couldn't articulate. "Well," she said, returning her gaze to the table, "I'll be here if you need anything." He watched her for a moment longer, then turned and left the room, the melody of her song echoing in his mind like a promise. Outside, the world moved, on cars passing in the street, the distant murmur of voices, the wind stirring the leaves of the old oak by the gate. But in Mateo's mind, the house had come alive, its silence broken by a single voice that sang to the glass and, unknowingly, to him. The days that followed carried a rhythm both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. Mateo found himself drifting, through rooms he had once considered lifeless, drawn by the gentle hum of Emilia's presence. She moved through the villa like a quiet breeze, stirring corners long neglected, and somehow in the process, stirring something in him that he hadn't felt in years. She arrived each morning precisely at 8, the click of the iron gate a soft herald of her presence. Her steps were measured, her focus unwavering. Yet even in her most mundane tasks, dusting the shelves, wiping the counters, folding laundry, there was a grace that captivated him. He found himself inventing reasons to linger in the kitchen, in the study, even in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or the faint thread of a song drifting through the air. One afternoon, as clouds gathered in a bruised sky and a hush fell over the city, Matteo lingered in his study, papers strewn before him, though he could not bring himself to read them. The words blurred, lines of text dissolving into the echo of Emilia's voice. He wondered at her story. What had brought her to his door, to this house, to this quiet place where silence had reigned for so long? A clap of thunder rolled across the sky, startling him from his thoughts. He rose, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand, and made his way down the hallway toward the kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of rain, of damp earth and something sweet he couldn't quite name. She was there, standing by the window, her hands wrapped around a teacup, her eyes on the garden where raindrops fell like silver coins. Her hair was loose today, a cascade of chestnut that framed her face in soft waves. She seemed unguarded in that moment, her posture relaxed, her expression contemplative. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure of his place in that quiet scene. She turned then, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them in that small sunlit space. "Do you like the rain?" she asked, her voice gentle, as though the question itself might shatter the moment. He cleared his throat, his hands finding refuge in his pockets. "I used to," he said, the words surprising him with their honesty. "When I was younger, I'd stand in it just to feel alive." A small smile curved her lips. "I understand that," she said. "There's something cleansing about it, like it washes away the dust of the world." He nodded, though he felt suddenly exposed, as if she had peeled back a layer he'd kept hidden even from himself. "I suppose I lost that somewhere along the way." Her gaze softened. "Maybe it's not lost," she said. "Maybe it's just waiting." He wanted to believe her, wanted to reach out and grasp the thread of hope she offered so effortlessly. But habits of silence are not easily undone, and so he said nothing, only stood there as the rain tapped its fingers against the window pane. She set down her cup and turned back to the sink, her movements graceful even in their simplicity. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her back to him but her voice warm. He hesitated, the invitation so ordinary yet carrying with it the weight of something more. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "I'd like that." She moved with quiet efficiency, filling the kettle, setting it to boil. He watched her. Every gesture, a turn of the wrist, a tilt of the head, seeming to carry a story he longed to learn. "Tell me," he said, surprising himself with the boldness of the question. "Do you always sing while you work?" She paused, her hand resting on the kettle's handle. "Not always," she said, turning to face him. "Only when I feel like it." "And what makes you feel like it?" He pressed, needing to know, needing to understand the light that shone from her in ways he'd never seen in this house before. She tilted her head, her eyes distant. "Memories, I suppose," she said. "Of my grandmother's songs, of the way my mother used to hum when she cooked. It reminds me of home, of simpler times." Matteo felt a pang then, a sharp reminder of the home he had let slip through his fingers. His wife's laughter, his son's footsteps on the stairs, these had all become echoes dulled by time and regret. "Does it help?" he asked. She smiled, a small, secret smile. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it feels like the only thing that does." The kettle whistled, a shrill sound that shattered the delicate bubble of their conversation. Emilia turned back to her task, and Matteo watched her hands as they moved, pouring the water, steeping the leaves, creating something warm and comforting. From such simple ingredients, she handed him a cup, her fingers brushing his just lightly enough to send a spark through his chest. He took it, his eyes on hers, and for a moment the world felt strangely balanced, as though something had shifted between them. He sipped the tea, the warmth of it chasing away a cold he hadn't realized he carried. "Thank you," he said. The words inadequate, but all he could manage. She nodded, her smile returning. "You're welcome." The rain continued to fall, a gentle percussion against the window, and in that small kitchen Mateo felt something inside him begin to thaw. He stayed there, leaning against the counter, his cup cradled in his hands as Amelia moved around him, tending to her tasks with a quiet grace that made him ache with a longing he hadn't known in years. He found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in so long, he'd nearly forgotten the sound of his own voice. He told her of his son, Gabriel, now 17, a bright boy with his mother's eyes and his own stubborn streak. He spoke of the house, of the way it had felt so alive once, filled with laughter, with arguments over dinner, with the hum of music drifting from room to room. Amelia listened, her eyes never leaving his face, her attention so absolute it made him feel like the only man in the world. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She simply listened, and in that listening Mateo found a solace he hadn't known he needed. He didn't know how long they stood there, the afternoon light fading to twilight, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. When he finally looked up, he realized the kitchen had grown dim, the shadows stretching across the floor like gentle reminders that time waits for no one. "I should let you finish," he said, setting his cup on the counter. Amelia shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "It's all right," she said. "Sometimes the dishes can wait." He smiled, a real smile, one that felt unfamiliar on his face but somehow right. "Thank you," he said again, the words carrying a weight they hadn't before. She watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "You're welcome," she said. He turned to leave but paused in the doorway, glancing back at her. "Would you sing again sometime?" he asked, his voice hesitant, unsure. Her smile was slow, warm. "If the mood strikes me," she said. He nodded, and though he tried to hide it, he felt the hope blooming in his chest like a fragile flower. As he walked away, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the house wasn't the only thing coming back to life. Days slipped into weeks with the subtlety of a drifting tide. Mateo found himself increasingly drawn to the corners of the house where Amelia's presence lingered. Sometimes it was the scent of her soap clinging to the air. Other times it was a half-finished melody, left behind like a note of hope. She moved about the villa as if it had always belonged to her, though she never acted as though it did. She respected its silence, its polished floors and old woodwork, but she also softened it, her voice, her laughter, her gentle footsteps. Mateo had never imagined how a single person could make a place feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent into a bruised horizon, he found himself in the library, a room he had long avoided, its bookshelves filled with volumes he had once meant to read but never did. The air smelled of old paper and dust, the heavy curtains drawn to protect the books from the sun. Yet the room felt different now, as though Amelia had left a mark even here. She was there, seated in the high-backed chair near the window, a book open in her lap. Her hair was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked up when he entered, her eyes lighting with a warmth that made his heart skip. "Mateo," she said, her voice soft but carrying through the hush of the room. He hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. She smiled, closing the book and setting it aside. "You're not interrupting," she said. "I was just thinking." He moved closer, drawn by her presence. "Thinking about what?" Her eyes drifted to the window, where the last rays of sun painted the sky in strokes of gold and pink. About how a house can hold so many stories, she said, even if no one's here to tell them. He nodded, the truth of her words settling deep in his chest. This house has seen its share, he said, his voice quiet. But lately it's felt empty. She looked at him then, her gaze steady. It doesn't feel empty to me, she said. Not anymore. He swallowed, the weight of her words pressing against something fragile inside him. Because of you, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't look away, didn't deflect. Maybe, she said, but also because of you. You're here now, Matteo, really here. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I don't know if I remember how to be, he admitted. For so long I've just existed. She reached out then, her hand warm and steady on his. Existing is the first step, she said. The rest will come. He looked at her, hand on his, and felt a rush of gratitude so fierce it almost hurt. Thank you, he whispered. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You don't have to thank me, she said. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen. He squeezed her hand gently, the contact grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Will you stay a while? He asked. She nodded. Of course, she said. They sat together in that quiet room as the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness gathering outside but leaving the library bathed in a soft amber glow. Matteo felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by a tentative hope he hadn't dared to nurture for years. A clock ticked softly on the mantel, each second marking the fragile peace that had settled between them. He told her of his younger days, of dreams he'd had of traveling, of building something that would last beyond him. He spoke of Gabriel, of the pain of letting him go, of the guilt that still clung to him like a shadow. Emilia listened, her eyes never leaving his, her presence a balm to wounds he hadn't known how to heal. She shared pieces of her own story, a small apartment in the city, a mother who had taught her to sing, a father who had worked too many hours to ever hear it. She spoke of laughter and loss, of the quiet strength that had brought her here, to this house, to him. As they spoke, the house seemed to breathe around them, its old bones settling in the evening air. Matteo felt as though they were weaving something together, something delicate and precious, a tapestry of shared moments that might one day be called home. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. A sudden gust sent, a branch tapping against the glass like a hesitant knock. Matteo glanced at the window, then back at Emilia. Would you like to go for a walk? He asked impulsively, surprising even himself. She tilted her head, curiosity dancing in her eyes. In the dark? He shrugged, a half smile on his lips. Why not? Sometimes the night shows us things the day hides. She laughed, a sound so pure it made his chest ache. All right, she said. Let's go. They rose together, their steps quiet on the old wooden floor. Matteo grabbed a coat from the hallway, offering it to her. She accepted it with a grateful smile, slipping it around her shoulders. Outside, the air was cool and damp, the scent of rain still clinging to the earth. The garden stretched before them, a wild tangle of roses and ivy and forgotten pathways. Emilia took his arm, and together they walked beneath the pale light of the moon, their steps slow, unhurried. They spoke little, content to let the night hold their words. The garden felt like a secret place, hidden from the world, a sanctuary built just for them. Matteo felt the tension in his chest ease, replaced by a quiet wonder. At the far edge of the garden, near the old stone fountain, Emilia paused. She turned to face him, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. Thank you for this, she said, for letting me see the house this way. He shook his head. No, he said. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be alive. She reached up then, her fingers brushing his cheek in a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. You never stopped being alive, Matteo, she said. You just needed someone to remind you. He covered her hand with his own, holding it there, letting her warmth sink into him. And you did, he whispered. They stood there in the moonlight, two souls brought together by chance, by fate, by a house that had always been waiting for their laughter to fill its rooms again. And in that moment, Matteo knew that the story of this house and of his own heart was only just beginning. The morning after their moonlit walk, Matteo awoke to a house that felt changed, though its walls, floors, and ceilings were the same as they had always been. Light streamed through the tall windows, pooling on the polished floors like spilled gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, he noticed the sound of birdsong, delicate and persistent, drifting in from the garden. He found himself smiling at the small signs of life Amelia had left behind: a flower placed in an old ceramic vase on the kitchen table, a humming melody half-finished on the air, a dish towel folded neatly but carelessly, as though she'd been interrupted mid-task. These simple human imprints turned the house from a cold monument of memory into a place where people might once again laugh and dream. Downstairs, he found Amelia already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her hair twisted into a loose braid that swung as she moved. She was humming, a different tune than the night before, something bright and hopeful that made him pause at the doorway. "Good morning," she said, glancing up and catching his gaze with a smile that warmed him to his bones. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft but carrying more certainty than he'd felt in years. "You're up early." She shrugged lightly, the motion graceful. "Old habits," she said. "When I was little, I'd always wake up with the sun, eager to see what the day might bring." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "And what do you think today might bring?" She considered this, her brow furrowing slightly. "Possibilities," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "Every day has them, but we don't always look for them." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over him like a comforting blanket. "You have a way of seeing things," he said, "things I've forgotten how to see." She set down the dish she'd been washing and dried her hands on a towel. "Maybe that's why I'm here," she said, her eyes bright. "To help you remember." A silence fell between them then, not uncomfortable but full of unspoken words and tentative hope. Matteo took a step closer, drawn by an invisible thread that seemed to connect them. "Would you like to see something?" he asked, a note of hesitation in his voice. "Of course," she said immediately, her curiosity evident. He led her through the house, past the grand staircase and down a narrow hallway he hadn't used in years. At the end was a small wooden door, its brass handle dulled by time. He paused, his hand resting on the knob. "This room was always my father's," he said quietly. "He kept it locked most of the time. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to open it." Amelia placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to," she said softly. "Not if you're not ready." But Matteo shook his head. "I think I am," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room smelled of old books and aged wood. A heavy oak desk sat beneath a window that framed the garden beyond. Dust motes danced in the sunlight like tiny spirits freed by his presence. Amelia stepped inside first, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the edge of a bookshelf. Matteo followed her in, his gaze sweeping over the room that had once felt forbidden. Memories rushed at him, his father's deep voice, the scratch of a pen against paper, the quiet authority that had filled this space. He moved to the desk and opened a drawer, half expecting it to be empty. Instead, he found a stack of yellowed papers, their edges curled with age. Amelia came to stand beside him, peering over his shoulder. "What are they?" she asked. He lifted the top sheet carefully, his eyes scanning the faded ink. "Plans," he said finally. "Blueprints. My father's projects. Some of them never saw the light of day." Amelia leaned closer. "He must have been a dreamer too," she said softly. Matteo let out a breath, a small laugh escaping him. "Maybe," he said. Or maybe he was just afraid to fail. She reached for his hand and held it in both of hers. Or maybe he was waiting for someone like you to finish what he started, she whispered. He looked at her then, her face so close, her eyes full of a faith he hadn't dared to feel in years. Do you really think I can? He asked, his voice raw. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I know you can, she said, because you already have, just by letting yourself feel again. He drew her into his arms then, holding her as though she were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. She rested her head against his chest, her breath warm and steady. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, for helping me see again. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. Thank you for letting me, she said. In that dusty room filled with forgotten dreams, Matteo felt the past loosening its hold, making space for something new, a future he hadn't believed in until now. They spent the rest of the day in that room, opening drawers, unrolling old plans, and talking about what could be. Ideas bloomed between them like flowers in spring, renovating the villa, bringing it back to life, opening it to others so they too could feel its magic. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the room with a golden glow, Matteo looked at Emilia and saw not just the woman who had come to wash his dishes and sing to his glass, but the woman who had sung to his heart, bringing it back to life note by note. He reached for her hand, and together they stepped out of the room, the weight of the past no longer a burden but a foundation on which to build. In the hallway, the house seemed to exhale, a deep, contented sigh, as though it too was finally ready to begin again. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of hope, like the first green shoots after a long winter. Matteo woke each morning with a sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years, a small thrill that came from knowing Emilia would be somewhere in the house, her presence a comforting constant in the shifting light. He found himself drawn to her voice most of all. Soft melodies drifting from the kitchen, small hums that seemed to settle the restless echoes that had once haunted the villa. Sometimes he'd pause outside the door, listening to her sing to the morning sunlight or to the clatter of dishes. Other times he'd watch from afar, captivated by the way she moved, how she brought life to even the smallest tasks. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Matteo found Emilia in the garden, kneeling among the neglected flower beds. Her hands were streaked with soil, and a smudge of dirt adorned her cheek. She looked up at him with a grin that lit her entire face. "Matteo!" she exclaimed, brushing her hands on her apron. "I found something." He smiled, unable to resist the warmth in her eyes. "What is it?" She stood, holding out a small weathered tin box, its lid rusted at the edges. "It was buried under the roses," she said. "I think it belonged to someone who lived here long ago." Matteo took the box from her, his fingers brushing hers, in a way that made his heart skip. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the years it had spent hidden beneath the soil. "Shall we open it together?" he asked. Emilia nodded eagerly, and they settled on the old stone bench beneath the arbor. With a gentle twist, Matteo pried the lid open, revealing its contents: a collection of faded photographs, a small locket, and a bundle of letters tied with a fraying ribbon. Emilia gasped softly. "Love letters," she whispered, her eyes shining. Matteo lifted one, the paper fragile in his hands. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still legible. He read aloud, his voice catching on the tenderness woven into each line. "Dearest, every day apart feels like a year, and I count the hours until I see your smile again." He paused, the words sinking into him like a memory he'd never lived. Emilia leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his. "Someone once loved deeply here," she said. Matteo nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Maybe this house was waiting for us to find these," he said, "to remind us that love, real love, survives even the longest silences." Emilia turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Do you believe that?" she asked softly. He met her gaze, his own heart laid bare. "I do," he said. "Because of you." She smiled then, a smile that made the world brighter, even as the evening shadows deepened. "Then let's promise," she said. "Let's promise that whatever happens, we'll leave something behind in this house too, something that will remind others that love still lives here." Tears stung his eyes as he nodded. "I promise," he whispered. They spent the rest of the evening reading the letters aloud, weaving themselves into the tapestry of love and loss that had shaped the villa long before they'd arrived. Each word, each faded photograph felt like a bridge between the past and the present, connecting them to something larger than themselves. When the moon rose high in the sky, bathing the garden in silver light, Matteo and Emilia stood hand in hand beneath the arbor. The air was cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of roses and earth and hope. "Emilia," Matteo said, his voice trembling. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." She turned to him, her eyes shining with a light that made him believe anything was possible. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, the words trembling on his tongue. "You've changed everything for me," he said. "This house, my heart. It all feels alive again because of you." She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that undid him. "And you've changed me too," she whispered. "I came here just looking for work, but I found so much more." He closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face. "I'm afraid," he confessed. "Afraid that if I let myself hope, it might all disappear." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Hope doesn't make things disappear, Matteo," she said. "It makes them stronger." He leaned in then, his forehead resting against hers. "Then I'll hold on to that," he whispered. "I'll hold on to you." And in the quiet of the garden, beneath a sky full of stars, Matteo Salazar finally let go of the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. He let himself believe that this house could be more than just a monument to the past. It could be a home, a place where laughter echoed, where love grew, where stories were born and lived and shared. He pulled Emilia into his arms, holding her close as the night embraced them both. And in that moment, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The house watched over them, its walls steeped in history and memory. But now it also held the promise of a future built not on silence and loss, but on love, hope, and the small, simple joys that made a life worth living. The days that followed blurred into one another, each one brightened by Emilia's presence and the renewed sense of purpose that bloomed inside Matteo. The villa itself seemed to respond to their energy. The old corridors filled with echoes of laughter that had long been missing, as if the walls had been waiting all these years for a reason to breathe again. They worked together, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes with shared smiles and quiet conversation, turning each neglected corner of the house into a place of light and warmth. Matteo found himself amazed at how the simple acts of dusting old bookshelves, polishing forgotten trinkets, and rearranging furniture transformed the rooms. With each task completed, it felt like the house was shedding its years of loneliness and stepping back into the present, where life, laughter, and love had finally returned. One evening, after a long day of cleaning and organizing, Emilia suggested they sit in the small conservatory at the back of the house. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted with streaks of indigo and violet, and the air was scented with the fragrance of jasmine climbing the walls. A single lamp cast a soft glow over their faces as they settled into the worn wicker chairs. Matteo leaned back, letting the hum of cicadas fill the comfortable silence between them. Emilia sat cross-legged, her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes reflecting the soft light. She looked at him thoughtfully, as if searching for something in his expression. "You know," she said finally, her voice gentle. "This house, this place, it's more than just bricks and wood. It's a living story. And you're the one writing the next chapter." Matteo looked around, taking in the familiar lines of the conservatory. The old glass panels etched with time, the wooden beams that had weathered so many seasons. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "For so long I just saw it as a reminder of everything I'd lost." Emilia shook her head, her braids swaying slightly. but it's also a reminder of what you can build, what you are. Building, she said. It's a testament to resilience, to hope, to love. He felt her words settle deep inside him, like seeds taking root. The idea that the house could symbolize growth instead of decay made his chest ache in a way that was both painful and freeing. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers entwine with his. "Do you ever think about what brought you here?" he asked softly. "To this house, to me?" She smiled, a touch wistful. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes, I think it was fate. Other times I think it was just a series of small choices, some mine, some made by others, that led me here. But either way, I'm glad it happened." Matteo squeezed her hand gently. "Me too," he whispered. The night air grew cooler and Amelia shivered slightly. Matteo stood and retrieved a soft blanket from a nearby bench, draping it around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper, something that felt like trust. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" he asked. "For letting me in," she said. "For giving me a chance to be part of your story." He felt emotion welling in his chest, tightening his throat. "You've done more than that," he said. "You've helped me find a reason to keep writing." She reached up and cupped his cheek, her thumb brushing his skin in a way that made his heart race. "Then let's write it together," she whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the lamp and the music of the night, Matteo knew that he wasn't just rebuilding a house, he was rebuilding a life filled with laughter, with hope, with the kind of love that made even the darkest corners feel like home. They spent the rest of the evening talking about the future, the dreams they'd once been too afraid to voice. Matteo spoke of opening the villa to others, turning it into a place where people could come to heal, to rest, to dream. Amelia shared her ideas for the gardens, her vision of flowers blooming where weeds had once grown. As the first stars appeared, overhead Matteo felt a sense of peace he'd never thought possible. He looked at Amelia, her face bathed in starlight, and realized that everything he'd been searching for had been waiting here all along. Not in the grandeur of the villa, but in the small shared moments, in the laughter, the tears, the quiet confessions that had stitched their hearts together. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead in a kiss that felt like a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. And in that old house, beneath a sky full of stars, Matteo and Amelia's story continued, not as separate chapters but as a single beautiful tale, one of resilience, of hope, of love found in the most unexpected of places, a story that would live on in the walls of the villa and in the hearts of all who stepped across its threshold, reminding them that even in the darkest times, love has a way of finding its way home.